Hey guys, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 5th Docomomo Macau seminar. And I'm the moderator tonight, I'm Vicky Leung. And our theme today is how to extend the life of buildings. And as you may know, a good building is much more than a functional materialization. It contains the durability and beauty together. As function usage may change over time, well-designed buildings are able to adapt to a new type of usage and prolong the period of usage. After its useful life cycle, a building can be reborn with a new world. But for that to happen, there must be a will to allow its adaptation to happen through proper assessment and partnership with the relevant stakeholders. This adaptation process must be integrated in master plan that give them a new meaning and a reason to exist beyond its original intent, in which a critical process must be created to question its transformation, to assert such maintenance and the additional effort implicit in adapting the building to its new life. And to discuss the topic tonight, we are delighted to invite two distinguished speakers, one from Australia, Sheridan Burke, and the other one is from Macau tourist, and he's originally from Bangladesh, and to talk about how to extend the life of buildings. And our first speaker, Sheridan, she's honorary life member, Ecomos Australia, principal, Robert A. Moore, architect and heritage consultants. And Sheridan trained in urban planning, architecture, education, and tourism management, and consult on heritage issues based in Sydney, Australia. And her senior management experience extends across 35 years in government, NGO, and private sectors. 20th century heritage is her specialist field of interest. She's currently working with the Getty Conservation Institute Keeping in Modern program, delivering international conservation management training course and conservation planning studies. She is also an expert member of Sydney Opera House Conservation Council. And she also has served as a vice president of Ecomos, a president of its advisory committee, and as president of 20th Century ISC. She was awarded Australia Ecomos honorary membership in 2015 and is an Ecomos Scientific Council office. And the topic tonight is renewing a World Heritage Site, the Sydney Opera House. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome our speaker.
Thank you very much indeed for that lovely welcome. Could I ask if the PowerPoint could go back to the start, please? It kind of jumped ahead a little bit. If we could go back to the first slide, that would be great. And it was lovely to listen to your presentation. A few more back than that, about 6 more back, further back. Still needs to go back further. Needs to go to the title slide. Still further, further, back to the start. Back. Back. I'm giving all my slides. That's it. Right. Great. That's the beginning. Thank you. It was great to hear, Rui, your presentation about the buildings at risk in Macau and the features that you've done through the Docomomo work, because a number of the things I'd like to talk to you about tonight actually really reflect those kinds of issues that modern heritage is facing all around the world. But you asked me specifically to talk about how to extend the life of modern buildings. And I think probably everybody in the room would maybe have a slightly different answer. If you're an engineer, you'd probably say, well, you build them strong and you keep them dry. And if you're an architect, you'd probably say, get the details exactly right. And if you're the owner of a business or a parent wanting to commission a house, you'd probably say, give me built-in adaptability, because that's what I need to allow my family or my business to grow with this building. And probably all of these responses are right, because they're all about being able to use a building sustainably in the long term. And when you're looking after an asset like the Sydney Opera House, a very large publicly owned asset, and now a listed World Heritage Site as well, all of those answers apply. We have to get all of those things exactly right, and we also have to be able to fund that work. So I want to focus tonight on how the life of the Sydney Opera House is being extended. It's recognised as one of the greatest buildings of the 20th century, a masterpiece of the human genius. It's a place of outstanding universal value, and it's clearly an icon of Australia. If you thought of one building in Australia, you'd probably think of the Opera House. It was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2007, but that happened after 4 attempts to have it listed. It didn't happen right away. Unusually and very importantly, when it was listed in 2007, the nomination dossier noted that the use and the function of the house was an integral part of its significance, and that change and adaptation of the property would be ongoing. It wouldn't stay the way it was in 2007. And some of the things I'm going to show you this evening are the work that we've been doing over the last decade, which has been called the Decade of Renewal, because the Opera House had some inherent problems with its interior. It had some maintenance issues that needed to be taken care of, and the New South Wales government in 2013 gave $275 million towards those works. And the works had to be very, very carefully guided. For those of you who've seen this building, you'll know that it was designed by Danish architect Bjørn Utzon in collaboration with another Dane, the engineer of Arup. And the building was constructed over 16 years, from 1958 to 1973. It opened 6 years later than expected, and it cost 10 times the original budget. Fortunately, the budget was substantially funded by a public lottery, but the delay and the massive budget overrun caused a rift between Bjørn Utzon and the government of the day, and he left Australia in 1966, and sadly he never returned. So the building was actually completed by a group of Australian architects, Hall, Todd and Littlemore, and they are responsible essentially for most of the interiors. The work that's underway at the present time is the refurbishment of both of the major halls, the Concert Hall and the Opera Hall. And I'll look with some slides that I just took last week actually at the approach that we've taken to this, these massive changes. I also want to reflect a little bit about the role of the voice of the original architect of Bjørn Utzon and how he's been incorporated into the work. But especially I want to look at the conservation management tools that we've been using, because they've got a great deal of opportunity to use them really all around the world. They're very universal. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the Getty Conservation Institute and the work that they've been doing to make that possible. So the Sydney Opera House is actually a very well looked after building. It's had 4 conservation management plans over its life. In Australia, conservation management plans are renewed every 5 to 10 years or when work happens. And we also have a quite unique document called the Utzon Design Principles, which is a collaboration with Bjørn Utzon done at a distance in 1988, when we knew that the building would need to have some fundamental changes. And we went back to him and said, how did you conceive change might happen? How did you see this building would extend its life? And we had a wonderful dialogue with him. But I'd have to say that for a lot of modern heritage places, the outlook isn't so positive. And if I could have the next slide, please. Here are 6 buildings, 6 heritage icons that are under pressure at the present time. And there's 6 stories of threat or recent demolition, sadly, that the Docomomo 20th Century Committee has been involved with. On the top left-hand side is the Viking Ship Hall in Roskilde in Denmark, built 1967 to 68 to a design by Erik Sorensen. It was the very first late modern building to be listed for protection in Denmark. That happened in 1998. But it's badly affected by climate change and a combination of floods. And in 2013, the flood which you see in this photograph and subsequent escalation of structural decay led the Danish Minister for Culture, against the advice of her own expert and the advice of the Department of Culture, to actually delist the building. The Viking Ship Museum now intends to demolish the building and to build a new one. The building still stands at the present time, but it is very, very threatened. The second building, on the centre building, I should say, on the upper level, is the Al Swaba complex in Kuwait, built in 1977, a housing complex designed by a Canadian architect, Arthur Erickson. It was demolished through 2019 after a long period of vacancy. It occupied a large and very valuable site in the centre of the city of New Kuwait. The building on the right is Mia Nonkojo Hall, the Kaikan, a culture hall in Japan, designed in 1966 by a metabolist architect, also vacant for 10 years. And virtually without maintenance, it was demolished by the Prefecture Council in 2019, despite international heritage alerts. The lower left-hand building is the Sirius public housing complex here in Sydney, designed in 1978 by another Canadian, Theo Gophers, but a building that's been at the centre of controversy since the State Heritage Council recommended that it be listing and the government refused to do so, offering it for either demolition or redevelopment. The building is currently the subject of a redevelopment proposal. The centre building on the lower level is the Shukov Moscow radio tower, designed in 1919 to 22. He was a pioneer in hyperboloid, difficult word, steel construction. This tower is an entirely Russian concept, and it influenced structural engineering and architectural creativity for a century globally. And it's one of the modernist icons of our time. But without use now and without maintenance, it's looking to a grim future in terms of its longevity. The last building on the right-hand side is the Y building in Norway. This was designed in 1969 by Erik Visco, and it's one of Norway's most important symbols of post-World War II optimism and the belief in international democracy. It includes artistic contributions by Pablo Picasso, but sadly, after damage in a terrorist attack and ongoing security concerns, because it's occupied by the government, it was demolished just a couple of months ago. The Picasso murals were saved to put in the new building, but the building itself is gone. So this pressure is around for all sorts of buildings all around the world. If I could have the next slide. But the types of problems that they face are somewhat universal. Sometimes they're about materials and repair. Sometimes they're about maintenance or loss of use. Sometimes they're just the scale of the thing is very difficult to find a new use for. Climate change is a very real threat that we're facing at the present time, and modern buildings are no different. The value of the sites, where they're large sites, and the change in the way in which cities operate has also been a real pressure. And security and the need to adapt places for security issues is a major problem as well. But with all those problems, there are cures, and there's lots of examples where these issues have been resolved. But the three principal problems that we need to kind of continually come back to is that there's generally a lack of public awareness about the significance of modern heritage. It's a little too close to the people who are making the decisions. They remember it as children. They don't see it as heritage. Often there's a lack of shared knowledge about how to look after it. And sometimes there's a lack of shared experiences of other examples that we can learn from as to how to look after these places and adapt them. And I guess as heritage professionals, we're always interested in learning about these kind of things. And I want to share some examples with you today. So the next slide, I want to introduce you to the practice of conservation management plans for modern heritage places. And I want to use the Sydney Opera House to talk about that. But in my professional practice here in Sydney, we've been working on conservation plans for all these different kinds of buildings at the present time in Kuwait, in Tokyo, in the US. And it's the same kind of principle that we use every time. I can have the next slide. One of the things that has happened in the last 10, 15 years is that there's been an increasing recognition at a World Heritage level of modern heritage. In 2002, 2003, there was a study done by ICOMOS, which is called Filling the Gaps. And it was a review of the types of places that had been listed and the geography of what had been listed. So they looked at it chronologically, typologically, and geographically to see where there were gaps. And one of the major gaps that came up was modern heritage, because at that time there were only 12 places of 700 odd at that particular point listed. And it was identified as something that we needed to investigate further. ICOMOS took this seriously, and they established in 2005 the 20th Century Committee that Rui and I both belong to, and its role was to support ICOMOS in its role as an advisory body to the World Heritage Convention. And we've been very active in that sphere, but in a lot of other spheres as well. If I could look at the next slide, please. So here's an example, sort of a selection of the types of places that have been listed. So in the first 30 years of the convention, there were only 12 modern sites listed. But just in the last 15 years, there's been more than 40 listed. So the numbers are getting up, and they're starting to be different types of sites. So initially, they tended to be individual buildings. There was one or two cities, Brasilia up on the left-hand side, in the centre at the top, the Berlin housing estate. So large areas that were already being managed well by their federal or local government, but added the World Heritage listing in recognition of their outstanding universal values. But each of these places, before it's listed, needs to have a management plan done. So again, I keep coming back to, if you want your building to have a long life, a management plan is a really valuable thing. And the next slide, please. So the lack of shared knowledge is something that we can really get over because of the value that we now get from the internet. There's loads of material there about management plans. Here are some of the best and ones that I certainly use in private practice. There are management guidelines that have been done internationally for UNESCO sites. Here in Australia, we follow the Borough Charter and its guidelines, all of which are available online and very adaptable to any place. And in particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the document on the right-hand side, which is it's called the Approaches to the Conservation of 20th Century Heritage. And it was developed by the ICOMOS 20th Century Committee over about a 10-year period. It took quite a long time. And initially it was mostly about architecture, but the current version also covers landscape, cultural landscapes, ensembles of urban areas. It's now in 17 languages. I'm pretty sure it's in Portuguese. It's certainly in Chinese. And those are available on the internet. So have a look at them, because that guideline document is the most useful kind of thing to use in your day-to-day practice. If I could have the next slide. There's also so much available to us now through Zoom. Next week, for example, there's a webinar on conserving concrete. Oh, it's called a virtual event, I see actually, but I think it's a round table, which the Getty are running. They've recently published some guidelines about conserving modern concrete, and I think that's going to be talking about those kind of things. And the next slide. They've also been very active through their Keeping It Modern program in supporting the preparation of conservation plans and in some cases works, and through grants. Here are some examples just over the last couple of years of places who've received those grants. And now all the conservation plans that have been done are available online. So if you want to look at the way in which people have approached anything from a swimming pool in Morocco to a sports stadium in Tokyo, they are available, and they all follow basically the same process. If I could have the next slide, please. One of the things they all do is try and engage with stakeholders. And sometimes those are people or organisations who are influential, like Docomomo or ICOMOS, or regional, local, national heritage authorities. Sometimes it's people who are innovating and finding new ways of doing things. And one of the places to look for where that's happening are awards, I find. The Asia Pacific Heritage Awards run out of UNESCO in Bangkok. Whilst it's not specifically about modern heritage, quite frequently, modern heritage is the recipient of the awards, and it's there that you see current experimental work or good practice examples. And I know there've been a couple of those given to contemporary buildings in Macau, or extensions, I should say, to modern buildings in Macau. So although it's a bit of a crazy world out there with COVID and so forth, we do have some advantages at the moment by being able to get in touch with those influential organisations through Zoom. The next slide. One of the things that the Getty has been doing very actively is trying to help identify potential modern heritage sites early. And this document will come out in the next couple of months. It's been, again, something that's been being worked on for more than a year. What it tries to do is to identify the themes of history of the 20th century, and with it, the types of buildings and sites that are reflective of those themes of history. It was prepared by historians with an international reference group of architects and engineers, and 10 different themes have been identified. And they range from things like war and its aftermath to rapid urbanisation that's been experienced in the 20th century, and, as I said, 10 different themes. We see this as being a really useful document for people doing survey work, for giving comparative analysis. When you need to know just how significant a place is, this will assist. And I encourage you to watch out for it when it comes out, and it'll be available as an ebook, as a download, so very, very accessible. And the next slide. Here are again some examples, and the two that I really want to concentrate on now, the Opera House and the Eames House. These are all available online as well. And the Eames House Conservation Plan, which incidentally won the Docomomo, US Docomomo Award last week, it's composed of two parts. There's a standard, quite detailed conservation management plan, which has history and description and lots of references and beautiful photographs in it, the standard document. And then there is an overview document, which is 14 or 15 pages. And it's meant as a document that you can hand out to your board members, to people who are going to fund you, perhaps to the general public. And it explains very visually why the place is significant and what sort of policies are necessary to look after it. So it's a kind of a new format way of doing conservation plans. And the next slide, please. So just coming back to the approaches, the guideline document that the 20th Century Committee has written, it's only 9 articles. It's a very short document. The second article is to always think about applying conservation planning methodology and the best kind to it. And the next slide. And when it talks about conservation management plans, all it means, it's very, very simple, is simply working out what's significant about the place and writing policies to look after it. So Jim Kerr is the man who wrote one of the documents called the Conservation Plan. I guess what makes it very different to other kinds of documents that are often written to look after historic buildings is that it's not a repair schedule. It's not a campaign for funding to get money for repairs. It's basically an analysis of why the place is significant and how to look after it. It usually leads to a repair schedule or to funding or, campaigns to get money for the roof or whatever. But it's the precursor, it's the detailed analysis about why it's important. And the next slide. These documents are always interdisciplinary. They're always done with stakeholders. The best are short. Sometimes they're multi-volume. I recommend against that. Try and keep them as short as they possibly can. And they do change as you're developing them. You may have a position or a knowledge base when you start, but it won't be the same when you end. So it's an iterative process. And the policies that you draft need to be agreed with the stakeholders and the people who'll use it. And they always follow 5 steps. If I can have the next slide. You can't possibly read this, but basically you can take this from Rui when this event is over. That's a standard format flowchart for the way in which these things are done. And that's the one presented by the Getty. And I'll just take you to the next slide, which is just the headlines out of that. The next slide. So 5 steps. Understand why it's important, assess significance, And not all parts of your building or place will be significant. Some will be less significant. Gather the information you need to know, everything from drainage to bushfire hazard, to the history, to the changes that have happened to the building, and then figure out what the conservation policies you need to use to look after it are. And then finally implement it, which is the stage we're now at with the Sydney Opera House. If I could have the next slide, please. So instead of seeing conservation as a reactive process, we need to repair it, we need to fix the roof, what a conservation plan tries to do is put you in a proactive situation where you know what you need to do and you're well equipped to do it. The next slide, please. So at the Opera House, we always use these three key strategies. We're working always to conserve the place, and that's all the things we might do to look after it, to adapt it, to repair it, and to use it. We have a big emphasis on sustainability and maintenance, protecting it from weather and damage. And with, I think it's 10 million people currently visiting it per year, we have a lot of wear and tear. And the third element that we work on very hard, and probably the most important of all of them, is telling the stories about the place. Because unless people understand why it's significant and understand the stories about it, they won't care about it, and politicians won't care about it, and we may not get the ongoing support that we need to look after it. So telling its stories are a really important strategy for us. So if I can have the next slide. So I've told you a little bit about the Opera House. It took a long time to construct. It cost a lot more than we ever thought it would. But nonetheless, we have had 4 conservation plans over the years of its existence. The first ones were general discussions about why the place was significant. It's really only the last one that's had a large number of policies in it. And that's because it was World Heritage listed in 2007, and we felt the need to be very careful about ensuring that we were doing the right thing by that World Heritage listing. If I could have the next slide. So we have a view that we need to respect all the values, and that goes well beyond the beautiful architecture and the wonderful interiors, and is very much about how it's used. So whilst there are lots of physical repair programs going on continually and lots of preventive maintenance, we also have to recognise that the changing needs of it being Australia's most important performing arts centre means that some of the fabric is going to change. So the room on the top right-hand side is currently undergoing extensive change because the requirements of music performance have changed since the building was designed. There's now a lot more demand for amplified music to be played in here. It was originally designed simply for orchestral music. There's also been a long-term concern that even for orchestral music, the orchestra pit and some of the reverberation mechanisms within the building are inadequate. So some of those major renewal works that I mentioned before have been about looking at that. We've also come to realise in the last decade that this has been a place of importance for Indigenous people. It is at the point in Sydney Harbour where the salt water coming in from the ocean meets the fresh water. We didn't know that. The early colonists had no idea. It's only been revealed recently. And so it's always been an important meeting place for Aboriginal people. So the point on which the Opera House actually sits, it's called Tubagali in the local language, which means the meeting of the waters, the place where the waters mix. Obviously a great place for feasting and finding food, and a place where people gathered, met, talked, a long-term gathering place, and still is a gathering place. So the next slide, please. But as a gathering place now, it has other values than being a place where there was a lot of shellfish. Now it has more than 10 million visitors a year. It has only about 1.3 million of those actually attend performances. The rest of them are just coming to see the place. And interestingly, most of them want to touch it in some way. It's a very tactile building. People come up and pat it and lie on it and put messages under its tiles for other people. And so it's a continuing issue about how to it help visitors to enjoy it, but also make sure that they're not actually destroying it at the same time. We also need to support the resident theatrical companies and opera companies that are there, and they often have different requirements of the halls than what they were constructed for. And the interest in tourism is just mammoth. It's quite hard sometimes to be able to book onto a tour of the Opera House. They're given in 20 languages at the present time, and there's always, I don't know how many they do a day, but it must be upward of 100, I would imagine. There's also a massive number of transactions from the food and beverage outlets that occupy part of the site and would like to occupy more of the site. That's something that is always a tension between conservation and the commercialisation of the site. But what we know from some recent economic studies is that the Opera House contributes about $1.2 billion a year to the state economy. So it has a massive positive impact, as well as being a reasonably expensive place to look after. If I can have the next slide. So as Rui mentioned, I sit on the Conservation Council for the Opera House, and I also sit on the Design Advisory Panel. And what we're doing is always balancing the Opera House roles between being that masterpiece of architecture and being something that has to be lively and changing on a daily basis. We have to cope with aged infrastructure. We have, for example, when the Opera House was built, access for the disabled was not even part of the design. So what we've found is the need to improve that. In going back and looking at Utzon's original plan, we were able to find that he had anticipated this would be a need, and we've been able to work with some of those corridors and hallways that he identified and insert new lifts in certain areas. It's very skillfully done. It's taken a number of years to actually work it out in detail, and the first of the new lifts were operational last year. Very, very difficult thing to retrofit into a building like this. And as you can imagine, we have a huge amount of statutory compliance to do it, on a World Heritage level, a national level, and a local level, as well as all of the building codes and disability codes and so forth. So managing it on a daily basis, it's something that we need to have very clear guidelines about. So we have 2 or 3 layers of guidelines. And if I could have the next slide, please. The first one is one that was created back in the 1980s, 1990s, when Australia sought to re-engage with Jorn Utzon and ask him how he thought the building should be looked after going forward. And he's there in the centre photograph, the centre gentleman, and his son Jan, also an architect. And also the chap with the beard is Richard Johnson, an Australian architect. And the 3 of them worked together, and they together wrote the Utzon Design Principles. They are also available online if you'd like to see them. And they're the voice of the original architect saying how he thought the place could manage change, what sort of flexibility he saw that it had and he had designed it for. And the little sketch on the right-hand side is one that he drew while they were writing these documents. And it was him taking the memories out of his brain and writing it down on paper. If I can have the next slide. So we had the Utzon Design Principles, and we also had those older conservation management plans that I mentioned. And in Australia, we work with the Borough Charter, which is our guideline about looking after places. And one of the central principles of that charter is to do as much as is necessary, but as little as possible. So we had to go about really trying to understand the significance of every space in the building and every element in the building. And it is a very large complex of buildings. We decided that we would try and integrate the Utzon Design Principles into the new Conservation Management Plan, which hadn't really happened before. But we also recognised that we needed an immediate decision-making tool, so that when something happened, an accident, a carpet may need to be replaced just before a performance, something that might happen quickly, we needed to have a decision-making tool that anybody could apply. They didn't have to wait for the architect to appear. They needed to be trained to apply this tool. So what we did was create something called tolerance for change, which I'll take you through in a moment. But I'd also draw your attention to the little quote there on the bottom. We were very fortunate that Upton said he saw this building as one that would change, that it wouldn't be the same as it had been when he first designed it, that it would alter and it would go on to be something different over time. I'm not sure that many architects would be that humble about their work, but he certainly was. And the next slide. So to help us work through how we could get that day-to-day decision making done, one of the things we had to recognise was that some of the elements of the place weren't as important as others. So for example, obviously the sails are very important. Their form, their fabric, their shape, their location, absolutely important. But in the bottom slide there, you'll see a marquee that's been a temporary marquee that was placed on the forecourt. Not significant, not fabric of the place, but it had been there for 10 years because it actually gave a great deal of money to the Opera House in terms of being able to be leased out. So we identified that in the conservation plan as being an intrusive item and one that needed to leave. So there was no need, if once the Opera House found alternative sources of revenue, that item could go. And so we had to recognise that some layers of development were significant and some weren't. And the next slide tells you about the tolerance to change document. So how we test it, and I know that you can't read on the right-hand side, it's really just to show you that there is a table within for every space set out within the conservation management plan. And what it does is figure out how much tolerance to change each of those 4 attributes has. Can we change the form, the fabric, the location, or the function of this element? And that's the decision-making tool. And it's worked reasonably well. We don't have time to go into it tonight, but it's an interesting thing to have a look at, and it's very, very easy to use once you get the hang of it. The next slide shows you how we've been using it in the Opera House. So these are the slides. The slide on the right is one that I took a couple of weeks ago. On the left, this is the concert hall, and it's the great organ. This has had a wonderful history of musical performances in Sydney for more than 40 years. And there it is on the right-hand side. The orchestra pit has been removed, a new orchestra pit has been constructed. The front stalls have been altered and changed. There have been new acoustic treatments applied to the front of the boxes, all of which has gone through an extensive design review process and an approvals process, and it is in line with that decision-making tool that I spoke about before. So fairly massive works can still happen when you are World Heritage listed, when you are a very important site. The next slide, please. The area where I pointed out the marquee before, we've been able to open up the area on the plinth of the building immediately inside where you saw that marquee to become a function room, the Yalamundi room. You can see it in the upper levels there under construction. It was formerly behind the scenes service area, and it's now been opened up to being a function centre. So the money that was previously attributed to that marquee is now achieved within the building. The forecourt is now open, or the boardwalk rather, is now open. And all of the finishes and details of the interior of that room, the concrete in particular, has been retained, and its stories have been shown for people who are using the Yalamundi room to see. So there's a lot of interpretation happened there as well. And the next slide. So all of these examples that I've given you are based on this little circle that you see on the right-hand side, which actually comes from English heritage. And before them, it comes from economic theory. For those of you who are economists, you might see it. And basically it says that if you enjoy a place and you understand it, then you'll come to value it and you'll care about it. And so that's the cycle that the conservation plan tries to bring forward for people to care about the place, to conserve it and to look after it. So for a CMP to be successful, that's what it needs to do. And it might do it in in the sort of big scale about looking after the sales of the Opera House, dealing with the effect that climate change is already having on them. But it might also be, and if we can have the next and the last slide, it might also be on smaller things, fittings that are inside the house. If I could have the next slide, please. One of the extraordinary things about the Opera House that very few people have seen are the tapestry screens and curtains that were prepared for its opening and hung in the house for about the first 10 years. They were designed by an Australian artist, John Coburn, and they were there from 1974 for about a decade, but they're no longer hung at the house for a range of reasons. They weren't suitable for contemporary art performances. One of them was damaged. And so what we're trying to do at the present time is to work out a way that we can interpret their function and their use within the house, perhaps hang them occasionally. And you can see the central photograph there is when they were hung last year. And we've also made a series of podcasts about them so people can understand what the story behind the tapestries are. So from the large scale, from how the Opera House is being looked after in terms of climate change to how we're looking after the tapestries, these are part of the stories that are very much underpinning the conservation management plan. So if you were here in Sydney with me tonight, you would see that the Opera House is dark. You know, the site is closed. Everybody's working from home. There are very few performances going on. They've only just recently restarted and they're very limited in their scope. But tomorrow, the renewal works will go on and they will be finished by the end of the year. The CMP will be being used every day and the site interpretation will go on. So it's a living heritage site and hopefully we're equipping it to really work well into the future. And if I could have the last slide, which is simply about copyright. I hope you've enjoyed seeing a little bit about the Opera House renewal and you've seen a little bit of the Opera House through my eyes. And I hope you get the chance to come and see it for yourself soon. I hope you'll have a look at the podcasts that are there about the tapestry. They're really fun to listen to. And I'm really happy to take questions after the next presentation about what I've said. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Very impressive presentation. So we saved the Q&A section at the end.